Currently, there is a national conversation happening within Canadian Unitarian Council and their member congregations. In this past May, at the annual general meeting of the Canadian Unitarian Council, or the CUC, there was a spontaneous motion to adopt the 8th principle. This came after the presentation of the Dismantling Racism study group. The 8th principle was proposed in the study group report, and it states, "We, the member congregations of the Canadian Unitarian Council, covenant to affirm and promote individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." So, the group of representatives from our congregations, or from congregations across the country, were called to adopt this principle. There were a lot of things that happened in a very short period of time, but after much conversation and policy checking, the vote was called and the motion passed, 61 for and 22 against. Suddenly, the Canadian Unitarian Council had adopted an 8th principle. The executive director, Vida Ng, sent out notifications on all of her communication platforms to notify Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists across Canada that we now had 8 principles. It was a whirlwind. But it doesn't stop there. 4 days later, a letter came out informing everybody that while they had checked procedures and policies during the meeting and before the vote, they had not actually checked their bylaw statements, which supersedes all of those other documents. So the vote was considered not valid. However, they also stated in that letter that they were going to fix the problem. We are going to be having a special meeting 7 months after that one to right all of the wrongs and to reestablish this new principle. It was a very busy week in Unitarian Universalism in Canada, and it has turned out to be a significant part of the work that the staff at the CUC, as well as many ministers across the country, have been working on for the last 4 months. A very similar turn of events happened some 40 years ago that ended up leading to the very first water communion. In 1975, a UU member of the Lexington, Massachusetts congregation, Lucille Shuck Longview, participated as a Unitarian Universalist delegate to the United Nations Women's Year. The conference was held in Mexico City, and it identified 3 objectives which urged governments to formulate national strategies and priorities. Those 3 objectives were full gender equality and the elimination of gender discrimination, the integration and full participation of women in development, and an increased contribution to women towards strengthening world peace. Lucille Shuck Longview returned from this conference with a determination to change her religion, believing that Unitarian Universalism was a chief culprit in the perpetuation of oppressive sexism. After less than 2 years, Longview was able to make changes within her community. At the 1977 Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, there was a resolution about women and religion, with the final resolution stating that the General Assembly requested the Unitarian Universalist Association to join with those who are encouraging others in society to examine the relationship between religious and cultural attitudes towards women, and to send a representative and resource materials of to associations appropriate for furthering these goals. The resolutions of the Women in Religion that began in 1977 was the snowfall at the top of the mountain before the avalanche began, when the Unitarian Universalist Association decided to rewrite their principles in 1985. The language from the original 6 principles were to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. Or to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on the ideals of brotherhood, the justice, and peace. I can see why feminists of the 1970s would want these principles to be reworded. In the midst of all of the work that it is required to make these changes, and in the 8 years it took to turn the massive ship of Unitarian Universalism's association, women from across the continent gathered to witness one another, to worship together, to be held by women of faith in this great turning. In 1980, the Unitarian Universalist Women and Religion Continental Convocation, the first water communion ceremony, was held. The worship service was entitled, "Coming Home, Like Rivers to the Sea." Lucy Shuck Longview and the musician that many of us know of as Carolyn McDade were responsible for the worship service and explicitly stated that they wanted to create a new ritual that, quote, spoke to women's connectedness to one another, to the totality of life, and to their place on this planet. They go on to say that water is more than simply a metaphor. It's an elemental and primary, calling forth feelings of awe and reverence, acknowledging that the ocean is considered by many to be the place from which all life on our planet came. It is the womb of life, and that the amniotic waters surrounding each of us prenatally. We chose water as a symbol for our women's empowerment. Longview and McDade invited 8 women to bring water from different places across the continent. In the first water communion, women brought water together from the Rio Grande and the Assiniboine rivers, rainwater from Maryland, as well as water from both the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. I remember growing up and participating in the water communion in my first congregation in Regina. My mother had a mason jar filled with water that she would take to a women's retreat every fall. She would gather up water from many different trips and moments in her life, allowing herself to be reminded of the deep interconnection that she had to the world around her and the many women in her life. 2 years ago, at the celebration of my ordination, we had a gathering of the waters as well. Family from across the country and colleagues from around the continent and members of the Calgary congregation poured water into a communal bowl, a symbol of love and a connection to everyone who helped me discover and realize the ministry that I am called to serve. We celebrate this water gathering every year, a time to reconnect to the sacredness of ourselves, a sacredness of our communities, and also a time to recognize that change happens when we are separate from one another and when we come back together. There's so much turmoil in our lives right now. The world is still battling an unseen virus that is still killing on average 10,000 people in the world per week. Canada had one of the hottest summers on record. And so far this year, British Columbia has experienced more than twice the number of wildfires that happened in 2020. The Canadian Unitarian Council is in the midst of debating the addition of an 8th principle that calls out Canadian Unitarian racist behavior and racist systems. And Kelowna Unitarians is struggling with organizing weekly worship services and individuals camping and using illicit substances on our property, and also attempting to sort out its financial situations and their property ownership. And yet, we gather together. We gather together because we know that together we have more capacity than we do when we are apart. Much like in our story this morning, there are times in our lives when we are able to tumble and fall and roll down the mountains and hills and across all types of landscape. And there will be times when we reach the desert and though we throw ourselves over and over again into the sand, our efforts will yield no or maybe little results. We must think of ourselves in different ways, reimagine our possibilities, and the way that we move forward, like the stream raising up into the arms of the wind, remembering its essential self. Perhaps we can remember our essential selves as we partake in this communion.